welcome back everyone to our final session in stream 1 before our CEO wraps up for the day. So thank you. Excuse me, sorry. And yeah, for those who are joining us and haven't seen me before, I'm Tara and I'm the account manager here at Charity Digital. For audio description purposes, I am 28 years old and I am a white female with brunette hair. And I'm wearing a navy blue Charity Digital t-shirt today with gold earrings in. So yes, before we get started, please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box and let us know where you're joining from today. And I'll get started with an introduction to the session. So our final session is about user journey trends in 2025. The session will be delivered today by Angela Richmond, Research and Insight Specialist at Redfox Research. Angela will explore some of the key trends that we can expect to see in the donor and supporter journeys in 2025 and share advice on building in the perspective of both current and future supporters. So just before I hand over to Angela, I just wanted to remind everyone for a final time about our house rules today. So as with other sessions that have taken place throughout the day, the presentation will be recorded and it will be uploaded to watch on demand at a later date, along with the slides and any other resources. During the session, please do ask lots of questions in the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. If you see a question that you'd particularly like to see answered, then make sure you use the upvote feature so that we can prioritise answering that question first. And again, just a reminder to use the Q&A section instead of the generic chat section, otherwise your questions may be missed. Finally, hopefully not, but if you do encounter any sound or image issues, please do let us know in the chat and we'll do our very best to get the session back to normal as soon as we can. So without further ado, I will hand over to Angela.
Thank you, Tara. Hi, I'm Angela Richmond and I'm the founder of Redfox Research. I am a woman with white skin and a brown top in my 50s wearing glasses. So Redfox Research really concentrates on giving clients market research and insights to help them build brand awareness, connect with customers and develop marketing strategies. We work with clients in the third sector, but we also work more widely with tech brands and financial services brands. So I'm going to be looking today at some of the trends in customer journeys and some of the things that we can expect to see coming down the line in 2025. But I'm particularly going to look at this from the point of view of the donor or the consumer, because I think you've probably heard quite a lot today about the technology you can use. I think you've probably heard some stories from charities about how they're using the tech to manage and evolve customer journeys. But it is down in the end to about how we optimize the experience for supporters. So I think it's important to include that supporter perspective on this. So we'll look at how journeys are changing. We'll look at how consumers are looking for experiences to be connected across channels, the opportunities for hyper-personalization using AI, and the trends towards data as a valuable commodity. And as I said, I'm going to be looking at that from the supporter perspective. I'm going to share some insights from the charity sector. Redfox Research is the company that sits behind the Enthused Donor Pulse reports and also mass events. So I think we're on our 16th wave of Donor Pulse now. So we've interviewed many thousands of consumers and donors to understand giving and fundraising. But we also sit behind the mass events research, and that was, I think that dropped just last week. So I'm going to share some insights from that as well. But I think it's important to look more widely at what's happening in the broader market as well, and not just focus on the charity sector. Charities tend to be not that early to the party in the adoption of new technology is my observation. And I think that's for some very good reasons. Some of it's around being fairly cautious and to some extent risk averse. having concerns around governance and around the type of donors that they're dealing with. But also sometimes, you have to accept that it's to do with the amount of money and budget that's available to spend on these things. So I think it's good to look at what some of the more early adopters maybe are doing in this area, so that we can think about what might be coming down the road for charities. And Christina from Microsoft was talking about some of these trends earlier today, and the importance of thinking about donors as consumers, because the vast majority of people in the UK do donate to charities, so there is a huge overlap between donors and just regular consumers. So it's important as well to look more widely, because when consumers think about their expectations, they're setting their expectations by comparing the very best experiences that they get, regardless of sectors. So in other words, your donors are not judging your charity against other charities. They're comparing you to, maybe the fan experience that they get from Manchester United, where the experience is completely integrated across digital TV, social channels, even if they're lucky enough going to an actual game. So I'm going to look at some studies that I've also been involved in for Adobe, who are a huge MarTech company, marketing technology, and also Marigold. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, because I think you've probably heard a lot about how customer journeys are changing. But, now that customer journeys are very much online, the rules have really changed. And the online interaction might be the only interaction that you have with a donor or fundraiser. So in the same way that retailers dread the abandoned cart or shopping trolley, as charities, you'll need to understand where the weak points are in the customer journey and where you're losing people. And I was really fascinated listening to one of the sessions this morning, how to simplify donor journeys, where Vicky suggested that the click-through from potential donors was just 21%, which was lower than even I had expected. So, it's really important to understand where you're losing people, but also where you're losing data as well, because data is the fuel that fires customer journeys. So if you're losing data, then you're not able to really manage the customer journey. So the first thing really to think about is that journeys are no longer linear. We used to think about journeys as a single path. There was lots of marketing talk that had the funnel, talking about awareness, consideration, as though things were very linear. That's not true now. Even if people only interact on your website, they zigzag around, they approach their goal in many different ways. And as you'll know, that gets magnified when you start to add in other channels. So a journey that might start by recruiting a donor or a fundraiser on Facebook or TikTok then starts to ping pong around between social media, fundraising platform, and event platform, and hopefully at some point your own website. So that's no different for brands in other sectors. And what we know is that consumers are getting really frustrated by fragmented journeys. And what we're seeing from lots of the studies that we're doing is that consumers are looking, first of all, for a seamless journey that connects across both their online and offline experience. They're looking for personalized, rich content and rich experiences that recognize who they are and how they behave. And we'll look at that in a little bit more in a moment. And they want that all delivered at the right time. So from the Adobe research that I've been involved in, we asked about how important each of various things are in meeting your customer experience and expectations. Now, data assurance that my personal data is being used responsibly and securely is the absolute top thing. So 88% of people said that that was critically or very important. So that's kind of becoming a hygiene factor. But the number one behind that was seamless journeys. So 77% said it was important that they had consistent and seamless interactions across online channels. And I would argue that would also extend to merging online and offline. The things that are actually very close behind that are wanting timely information, rich tools and features that make their online experience better, like virtual try-ons or interactive product demonstrations, and thirdly, personalized recommendations that are tied into interests and purchases. So, you know, there is a strong demand for personalization if it's done in the right way. And what's happening is that whereas when we were talking about personalization, you know, maybe a year or so ago, we were thinking about personalizing based on different user segments, different donor segments. What AI is happening is it's making hyper-personalization a reality. And what we mean when we talk about hyper-personalization, and if any of you were in Christina's session for Microsoft, she talked about Copilot, but it could equally be ChatGPT. What AI allows us to do is it allows us to hyper-personalize experiences in a way that feels one-to-one to the consumer. So the automation, the use of data means that you can start to connect with fundraisers and donors, taking into account everything that you know about them, taking into account whether they've donated in the past, whether they're perhaps even standing watching the London Marathon, supporting somebody who's running the London Marathon. It allows you to bring together data that you hold, that you've collected, third-party data, all sorts of things. Now, I recognise that that's a way off for many brands, not just in charities, but in brands altogether. And as part of the Adobe research that we carry out, we also talk to practitioners, not just to donors. And you know, it's interesting that actually relatively few brands, you know, even when we start to look into you know, retail or media and entertainments, relatively few brands actually have yet to adopt real-time personalization. So only 39% of brands said that they use data and algorithms to personalize the website experience. And even fewer, 30%, said that their offers are updated real time to reflect the most recent browsing and purchase behavior. So, you know, these things are still in the future for many, many brands, and only a minority are doing that. What's kind of even a little bit further out there is the use of generative AI, which 27% said that they were routinely using to craft email and messages, and slightly fewer, 25%, to personalize images. And I think Christina talked about this a little bit as well, that when brands are talking about using generative AI, they're often not completely automating that. So they may decide to use Gen AI for ideation, but then fine tune the messaging after they've done that. They may decide to use AI to develop new versions of things, or localization, perhaps use a piece of content that's been created for one event to repurpose it for another event without having to do that manually. So there are opportunities for taking baby steps into this area. But as I said at the beginning, I think we have to take into account the perspective of the consumer or the donor, and think about what works for them and what doesn't. Another company that I've worked with, Marigold, we did some research to look at what consumers found cool or creepy when it came to different kinds of personalization. And what we found from that was that it really comes down to where consumers perceive the data comes from. So there's a tipping point that goes from when consumers feel that you're using either zero party or first party data. In other words, data that you've directly acquired from the consumer or they have given to you, freely. Those sorts of things are really considered fairly benign, and the majority of consumers are quite comfortable with having personalization managed in those ways. So I think I noticed a question in one of the earlier sessions where somebody said that they were surprised that there was such a high level of comfort in AI produced content. And I think you have to bear in mind that there are different kinds of AI produced content. So what we're seeing on the left here is a high level of comfort in content that is based on data that has been handed over in a very transparent and overt manner. Over on the right hand side, on the other hand, there is a lot more discomfort when consumers start to see personalization that happens based on data that they can't quite work out how the brand acquired that data. So, for example, if you get an email that highlights a particular location you visited, you may feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. So only 56% actually said that was quite creepy. And then if you get an ad from a brand you don't recognize targeting you based on your geographical location, that becomes even more of a concern. So 64% said that was quite creepy. It's important to see that not everybody finds it creepy. Some people find that cool, and that will be, a lot of younger consumers. So that tells us that these things will gradually become more and more in the public consciousness. The other thing I think that sometimes jars with consumers is if they feel that data is being very highly processed. So it's when they start to recognize that that data is being processed very quickly behind the scenes in an automated way in AI. So the one in the middle there that's not in the boxes, you can see that there's kind of a bit of a 50-50 split on offering promotions that are tailored to your activity within 2 minutes of you visiting a website or app. So that's data that you've essentially given to the brand because it's you visiting the website or app. But people quite often feel uncomfortable if that gets processed and served back to them so quickly that they start to realize that there is a machine doing that. So there's a lot of things that you need to take into account of in what will feel okay for people and what won't. And I think this all points to people realizing that data is now quite a valuable commodity, and they're starting to understand that. The point is that you need data. You need data to fuel the whole personalization, and the consumers are starting to see that. The Marigold research that we did last year showed that more than half of consumers had deleted unused mobile apps and browser extensions. More than a third had tightened privacy settings, and people were generally being more guarded about what they decided to share about themselves. And, cookies might now be with us for the foreseeable future, But I think it's made brands reevaluate their reliance on third-party data and start to look at first and third-party data. So you absolutely have to convince consumers and donors to part with their data, whether that's behavioural data, preferences, motivations. These are all critical data points for delivering personalisation. So it's become a transaction, you know, and if you think about what's happening in supermarkets, Nectar, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, they're all now making pricing dependent on whether or not you use your loyalty card. And it's not a reward for loyalty, it's a payment for the data that they're collecting as part of that. So data transparency is really, really important. If we look at the pie charts on the right-hand side, you've got 65% of consumers that say they're worried about how much data brands hold about them. But equally, you've got 67% who say, I'd be more open to granting permission to use my data if brands were more transparent about how they were using and securing it. So you know, donors will be open to using their data as long as they can understand how that is. And I think that carries through to the use of AI as well. So it's quite interesting that the number who say it's important to me to know if I'm talking to a human or a bot is 80%. So although we have the ability with bots to make them feel very, very human, that's not always the right way to go. And certainly there's brands out there that are going more of a route of making the chatbots or the virtual assistants actually feel a bit quirky and make it feel obvious that you're not talking to a human, so that it doesn't feel as though you're being fooled by any of this. And we're also we're doing a lot of research now at the moment to understand whether consumers expect to be informed about whether the content that they're seeing is being created using generative AI. Because I think there's some question marks about whether it's going to be okay to show a generative AI image to consumers as advertising, whatever, without actually saying what that is. And I think there's been some debate in the third sector about whether to use generative AI images instead of real supporters or real fundraisers or people that they're actually supporting. And that's something that the charity sector will need to have a think about. So let's talk about how to acquire data and insights then. There's really three places that data and insights can come from in your organization. There's all that data that you already hold that's very systematized. And we heard about some of this actually in some of the papers this morning, in the discussion actually about simplifying donor journeys. I was listening to Battersea and Scope talking about this. So, you know, you have a lot of system data. So when you're testing new personalized journeys, you can do A/B testing. And certainly John from Battersea talked about that this morning. That can help you give insights into cancelled giving, abandoned sign-ups, cost of acquisition from social platforms. Then you've got the knowledge, internal knowledge that your colleagues have. And again, I think John mentioned talking to some of the teams to understand what was the feedback that they were getting from donors as they went through journeys. That can be really golden information, but it can also be anecdotal, messy, biased. So it needs to be treated with a certain degree of care. And then you have more purpose-led market research data, which is where agencies like my own come in. And Kwesi this morning from Scope talked about how they had commissioned some UX research ahead of redesigning the customer journey. And I would imagine that was probably qualitative research. It may have been some observed interactions, but it would have helped them to understand how donors are navigating the site, whether it's the original site or a beta of the new site, where they're hovering, where they're getting stuck, where they're drawn in, what engages them, those much softer things. But equally, you could choose to run online surveys that explore what motivates donors, or how they perceive your brand, or how fundraisers want to engage with you. So let's talk a little bit about that last category. The data that you hold on donors and fundraisers is really only part of the picture. So external market research, it adds value because it is very much more directed. It lets you ask why something's happening. So it gives you the insights that you need to be able to fix the problem. A/B testing is brilliant, but it only allows you to see whether one thing you tried works better than another thing you tried. What more investigative research will let you do is start to uncover some of the motivations and the pain points of donors. And it helps you to look past current and past donors as well. I think one of the challenges with just using the data that's already held in the organisation is that it only really tells you about people that have decided to engage with your organisation already. So sometimes you need to look further than that, and you need to look at younger donors, fundraisers who you may not have engaged with yet, and understand how their priorities are different and what you can do to engage with those. And then the third way that it can help you is in crafting the journeys themselves, and not just the online journeys, but things like the events themselves. You may be missing opportunities because you don't realize that donors would like to engage with you in different ways, would like to be having different sort of events, for example, than the ones that you're running at the moment. So there is plenty of value to be gained from going to a more wider audience. And finally, I thought it would be worth sharing some of the insights from the Enthused Mass Event study, partly because it's just really new, and partly because it made me think about the donor journeys and the fundraiser journeys. What we've heard about a lot today is the journeys that you can manage and create yourselves. But once you get into fundraising for an event like the London Marathon or Great Runs or something like that, you're having a direct relationship with your runners, with your fundraisers, but in effect, they're all creating little individual journeys for the people that they're communicating with. And they all go about it in a slightly different way. You're relying on those people to go out and raise funds. And I know that you'll be doing a lot to try and formalize that, but they will all go about it in quite a different way. So, the good news that we've seen from mass events, and I know that the organisations like the Great Runs and London Marathon events are seeing this as well, is that there is a growing appetite for getting involved in mass events, and especially from younger people, Gen Z, and under 30s generally, are getting more involved in mass physical events because they want to be part of that sort of social thing. But the biggest blocker that we see is that people don't like asking other people for money. And 41% of potential mass eventers said they don't get involved because they don't like asking people for money. If we look back to a couple of years ago, the biggest blocker was concerns around health and fitness. And that's declined very much over the last couple of years. And it is now that people they enjoy the idea of taking part in the events, but they feel awkward about the charity aspect about it, of it as well. And to some extent, that's been solidified by the fact that much of this asking for money is becoming digital and is moving online. Still, when donors hear about requests, 43% said that they heard about the request in person. So somebody came and directly asked them whether they would contribute. But increasingly, donors do hear about requests for donations online. And the big ones really are Facebook and WhatsApp. And that actually aligns with what we also hear fundraisers saying are the key platforms that they're using. But, you know, the point here is that the request is being made in a way that takes the pressure off the donor to make a donation. They don't have to say something straight away. So it is more difficult in a way. It's easier in the fact that the fundraisers don't have to ask the direct question, but it's also easier to say no. And a lot of the time, the reasons that donors will say they don't want to donate or will decide not to donate, sometimes they don't have to actually say no, are very good reasons. It can be 43% said that they couldn't afford it, 33% said they didn't know the person very well, 22% said they didn't feel that warm about the charity or cause. And that in itself is quite an interesting thing, because when donors decide to support somebody who's running, it often comes more down to how close they feel to the runner than how close they feel to the charity. But if we put aside those sort of big reasons, we also find that actually supporters sometimes don't donate because they simply miss the moment. 13% said they didn't donate because they just forgot, and 8% said that they didn't have time to make the donation when they saw the request. So, you know, the moment just kind of flitters away, and that's a lost opportunity for charities, really. We also have seen that the more that donors see social media, the more that donors see people asking for money, the more likely they are to contribute. And 8% said that they didn't donate because the person wasn't really that active in asking for donations. And that, you know, the point about not being so active is that the most active posters, the fundraisers who post the most frequently on social media also maximize the fundraising. So those who post at least every day, sometimes more often, are much more likely to raise over £500, whereas those that post maybe only weekly will typically, you know, raise much smaller amounts. And a final point, and I'm going to move on to questions in a moment. A final point is that we also observe that those fundraisers that set a target are much more likely to maximize the amount that they raise. So fundraisers that have a target that's been set by the charity, which, you know, is pretty typical, I guess, in you know, in things like the London Marathon. If you look at those, then 20% of those raised over £3,000, 50% raised between £50 and £3,000. But very similar numbers actually to those that actually set a target themselves and shared with supporters. So I think this tells us that you don't always have to impose a target on supporters, but you do need to encourage them to have a target and be public about the target. The fundraisers that raise smaller amounts tend to either have a target that they keep to themselves or have no target at all. And if you have no target at all, you're probably going to raise relatively small amounts. The 62% who didn't have a target raised under £500. So having that target is really important. So just to sum up then, really, you know, the things that I would say to think about for laying the foundations for hyper-personalisation next year are around first of all, getting your customer data in order, because that has to be joined up in order to take advantage of AI and personalized journeys. Secondly, to have really clear policies on data governance, because you need to create trust with your supporters, but also protect your brand. The third thing to do is to go and acquire insights about what donors and fundraisers want in terms of content, experiences, journeys. And then fourthly, that will allow you to connect experiences across channels and touch points. So I'd love to know if you have any questions or anything that you'd like me to clarify on that. And I guess I'll hand back to Tara for that.
Yeah, hi Angela, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. So I think we're just seeing the one question having come through, but we're quite close to time anyway. So yeah, that one is just on how it says, how can we understand why visitors to our fundraising page don't complete their journey? So great to hear your perspective.
So I think one of the ways that you can do that is you can start to go out and talk to people. I think you need to do some qualitative research to understand that. Sometimes in those situations, you need to set up a scenario. So you may not be able to actually take somebody who's been in that situation, but you can ask people to complete journeys on your website and get them to talk through what they're thinking at different points. So what you don't know is whether somebody has just felt they'd changed their mind and didn't want to do it, or whether you made it too difficult by having forms that they had to go through, too many steps to go through to actually make the donation, or whether it may have been that the options that you gave for payment didn't tie in with what they wanted. And until you put somebody in front of that page and get them to talk about it, you won't be able to rule out those very practical things. So I think that's the first thing to do, is to rule out any of the practical blockers that are getting in the way. And then you can do broader market research to understand what might motivate them more in terms of the cause. But I think the first thing to do is to understand whether there are practical blockers on the actual page.
Sure. Thank you so much, Angela. And I think that's really relatable in terms of what you were saying about the sort of length of the form that you're asking people to fill out. We've certainly seen it internally at Charity Digital when we're conducting surveys and looking at the optimal length of the survey and, what impacts on us sort of having a drop-off rate. So, yeah, really, really interesting point there. Another question, it'll probably have to be the last one as we are near time, but what are the main ways charities are doing hyper-personalization in their, or using hyper-personalization in their marketing?
Well, I haven't actually seen any hyper-personalization from charities, no, actually, that's not true. I think one of the ways that charities are starting to do this is through apps and tying up fundraising actually on the day, so on event day. So once the idea here really is that once supporters then go and watch you on the day, you've got an opportunity to give them trigger points to donate more or to talk to other people. So the apps are good because they bring in location data, and although I said earlier that that location data can be a bit freaky, when it happens in a contextual way that feels right and adds to the experience and the occasion, it can work really, really well. So I think location data and stuff happening actually on event day is a good place to start.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Angela. That's yeah, very, very insightful. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. So yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, just a reminder for everybody who's joined us that the session will be recorded and the slides and resources will be made available to you by the end of the week. So again, if you've missed anything, then please do not worry. So thank you again for everyone who's joined us for this session and all throughout the day. And yeah, that brings us to the end of Stream 1 session. So please do stick around for a brief wrap up from our Chief Executive Officer, Jonathan Chevalier, who, and once again, yes, thank you so much for joining. Do take care.
Thank you.